This is it. This is the final push for the Badger Cave before I have to get everything in order for the lawyer. September 1st was the date to get funding in place through the bank. Unfortunately, I received bad news on funding through the bank, namely that there will be no funding from the bank. My income exemption was declined despite being pre-approved for a loan. All this happened after I made my offer to purchase with the understanding that I would get a loan. So even if I had wanted to cover the $3,000 fee they sprung on me at the last moment for a commercial appraisal, or take the equity out of my house, they still wouldn't have approved me to be able to pay the $115 of interest each month for the loan. The fact that I'd done something similar 8 years ago was apparently irrelevant, or too long ago. I don't have enough credit history with the bank. But good news, during the last conversation I had with the banker after she told me I wasn't going to get the loan, she offered me the opportunity to buy a credit card. Yay! Dealing with the bank has felt a lot like this.
I am altering the deal. Pray I don't alter it any further.
People have asked me what bank it is and which banker I went through, but I'm not naming names for liability reasons. I will say that Bunny and Karen both informed me that they've been burned by this particular bank in the past. I apologize for the change in deadlines and the general clusterfuck this fundraiser has been because of it. September 1st was the original date to get the funding in place through the bank. September 9th is the date to have the funding in place for the actual purchase. So we have 2 days left to get to 40,000 K. Now, if you're not thinking of supporting, I just ask if you spend a moment and figure out why. And tell me why in the comments below. Give me good answers, answers that if I were to allay your fears, you would actually become a supporter. And if asking yourself why, you say, why not, go to feedthebadger.com. Up to this point, I've asked you to help me out with the monthly payments, or donate one time. This time I'm only going to ask you to donate to the Badger Cave. If everyone listening now just donated $5, we'd be golden, so any amount you choose to give matters. Evil, subhuman, white, heterosexual, cisgendered male who should check his privilege and live in shame writes, "Wait, you have savings? And your last resort after asking for donations and mortgaging your house was going into your savings? Seriously? Okay, now you're getting annoying. Many of the men you're asking for money don't have savings and are living paycheck to paycheck and or giving most of their income to a woman in some capacity. If you have savings, use it to pay for your own damn business venture." Since you asked, evil subhuman, I will tell you why I'm trying to keep my savings out of this as much as possible. Of course, as soon as I do explain this, I'll have someone else pop up and say that I'm complaining. As someone who's self-employed, if this volatile, controversial concern goes tits up, I won't have access to unemployment insurance to float me through finding another job that's compatible with my disabilities. After the Calgary Expo debacle, I don't even have access to the marketplace where I was offered jobs in my field. This necessarily severely limits my networking capabilities. The arts community is heavily feminist, meaning having my name publicly associated with men's rights and dragged through the mud in the media has likely killed my career as a professional artist. Not to mention, I can use my savings to live off of and keep Honey Badger Radio afloat financially if necessary. The only other alternative, should it go really south, would be to fire people in Slash production, or to stop creating shows entirely. So yeah, I've stocked something away for a rainy day since I've torched a career in my chosen field in order to advocate for men's rights. It's also there to float me just in case Honey Badger Radio encounters any funding trouble, so I don't have to close shop. Evil, subhuman, white, heterosexual, cisgendered male who should check his privilege and live in shame further writes, "In all honesty, I'm not donating because I see the greatest men's rights issue as being the fact that men have to purchase women's empathy, affection, and love in our lives. Every woman, to some degree, expects us to drain our blood and squander and shorten our lives working 10 times harder than we would need to in order to support ourselves just to purchase some companionship and intimacy in our lives. And in the current climate, it's more often than not a short-term purchase. We are never appreciated for our humanity, and our company and affection is never seen as a fair and equitable exchange for the company and affection of women, not without additional payment." Okay, you don't pay me to care about men. You don't pay me to say I care about men. That's sort of a retarded thing to say, honestly. I'll care about men whether or not there's a badger cave in the world. I'll care about men whether or not I'm paid to devote myself full time to creating content to oppose the tide of propaganda targeting men. I will care about men, and I will say that I care about men without a single dime. We don't ask people to pay directly for our content. We give it away for free, and we ask you to voluntarily support the production of our content and one-time initiatives. This isn't a typical business model. A typical business model would have you pay up first before you get the content, but we don't do that because making sure this gets into the hands of those who need it is our first priority. So putting any restrictions on its distribution is a non-starter for us. You don't have to pay me to fight the hatred spewed towards men or support men. I'd fight with a sharpened stick and a rock. What you do pay me for is to take the fight to another level. And this is the next level. There are gradations of intervention and help. The hardest target in this current atmosphere may be a media company that tells men's stories without apology and without compromise. Now, why is a media company a hard target? Because it has the ability to counter the narrative. In fact, the ability to counter the narrative is why it exists. However, don't discount the support that hearing, listening, and not judging men's stories gives men. Both myself and Karen and the rest of the Badgers have been told by men that knowing someone was out there who recognized that what they were going through made them feel like they weren't alone. Knowing someone was listening to their stories and not dismissing them as mansplaining, that in itself stopped them from killing themselves. I would do this regardless. But if I didn't have the resources I have, what I would be doing would be very limited. A media company may be the hardest fucking target in men's rights, but that doesn't mean it's not also supporting men. In fact, it's entirely possible we're doing it better than the so-called professionals who have money for helplines. Listen to this from Jane Powell, CEO of the Campaign Against Living Miserably, or CALM, a men's helpline. Quotes from her published in a national newspaper in the UK. CALM's chief executive Jane Powell said, "The research underlines that so often their own worst enemies, men, need new rules for survival. Outmoded, incorrect, and misplaced male self-beliefs are proving lethal, and the traditional strong, silent response to adversity is increasingly failing to protect men from themselves. Men need to talk before they hit a wall in crisis or feel that they are at the end of the road," she added. "The normality of women freely discussing their troubles is undoubtedly a factor in declining rates of female suicide and underlies the need for a gender-based strategy in suicide prevention. So far, government and society has failed to act on this self-inflicted, yet preventable slaughter of our husbands, partners, and brothers and sons." Incidentally, in this article, it also mentions that men feel additional pressure to remain strong during times of crisis. What that generally means is that they put their emotions aside to tend to those of others. Maybe that's why women are managing these crises more than men. Have you considered, Jane Powell? Have you considered that possibility? This group, men, are hard to reach. They don't see themselves as victims, but they believe that saying they need help in some way makes them look weak or less of a man. We must bust this myth. Simply put, there is a crisis in masculinity, where men feel unable or unwilling to get help, even when they are hit by catastrophic life events. You know, I used to think CALM was one of the good ones before I read this article and found out a bit about Miss Powell. I hope it was just cherry picking. This interview with Jane. Because if it isn't, then Jane doesn't have a clue what she's doing. Or maybe she does. Men are expected to do the heavy lifting of society. That's why you see them every day doing the heavy lifting of society. Jane, if you want to be able to flush your toilet, turn on your office coffee maker, and type on your computer, you can thank men for all of that. Of course you don't, because you're an ideologue, and you believe that men don't create society for the comfort of women. Instead, men oppress women. This is the first society on earth in which the rulers shovel the shit of the people they allegedly rule. In one of CALM's surveys, CALM describes how it's actually fairly easy to access the groups of men CALM targets, and yet those men apparently don't want to access CALM. Why don't I explain some possibilities as to why for you, Jane. Why men don't turn to your service for help. Possibilities other than men are the problem and need to change. Let's imagine there's a man who's paid to push a boulder up a hill for a living. And in order to push that boulder, he has to wear a support belt to protect the muscles of his back from being damaged. Let's say this back support is causing the man a problem with pinched nerves, so he goes to the doctor to see if there's anything she can do to help him. The doctor examines the man, and then she emphatically insists the man has to take off his back support. No matter how much he says, "Doc, I can't. I need it to prevent hurting my back in my job." She just gets angrier and angrier until she's screaming, "Why don't you care about that pinched nerve? You're so attached to that belt. You have a crisis in back support." The crisis here has nothing to do with back support or masculinity, because like the laborer support belt, masculinity is enabling men to cope with the demands placed on them. But as an ideologue, Jane, you're not just that doctor screaming in a man's face to get rid of the back support he needs to do his job. No. Once you've got done judging the man for not taking his back support off, you turn around and say, "Oh, by the way, I have a boulder for you to lift." I can tell you something. I'm not a man, but if someone postured about understanding what I need better than I do, I would tell them to fuck the fucking fuck right the fuck off. Would you even think of saying the same with women? If women weren't accessing your service, Jane, would you call it a crisis of femininity? No, you wouldn't. You'd try to figure out how to change your service to accommodate their needs. If anything is killing men, it isn't a crisis of masculinity, it's a crisis of expectation, namely the expectations that women and society put on men, including the expectation that men change to suit the services that are supposedly there to help them. What's causing men to kill themselves, Jane, isn't masculinity. Masculinity is preventing them from killing themselves. What's causing men to kill themselves is losing their children in family court, being more likely to be jailed as a victim of domestic violence than their abuser, being looked over for promotions and educational grants, and be targeted by government propaganda as if they were enemy combatants. There's no crisis in masculinity. There's a crisis in mental health. There is a crisis in government ethics. There is a crisis in family courts. The war society is waging against men is driving them beyond their ability to cope. You're demanding that men accept personal responsibility for their failure to get help, rather than realizing that maybe, just maybe, men don't want to get help. Men don't want to get help from the guns that are shooting them. In fact, it's worse than that. There is one expectation that, when lifted from men, possibly does the most to improve their mental health. In the narrative of ideologues like Jane, men aren't pushing boulders uphill. Men are given every advantage, all the privilege, and they're practically carried about in golden litters borne by women. So if men fail, according to Jane's ideology, it's not because people are expecting them to lift boulders, it's because they were so incapable. They couldn't even manage to survive being carried about in a litter that women have to strain to lift and granted every advantage. Jane's ideology is yet another demand placed on men to somehow do the heavy lifting of society, but also believe that they're the ones being lifted by society. Jane is that doctor lambasting our laborer for wearing back support, at the same time insisting he carry her boulder made of lies. Jane and others like her are the people government gives power and money to prevent male suicide. Jane and many like her say that they want to prevent men killing themselves, but they focus on telling men that they need to change. And how fascinating that an ideologue has created a service in which she appeals for more funds to tell men that they're doing masculinity wrong in order to help men. Yeah, you men, you're doing depression wrong. That should help them. It's not a macho desire to appear manly that's causing the pain, Jane. It's persecution by the courts, it's losing their kids, and it's a political ideology that hangs the entire weight of society's failures on men's shoulders and refuses to acknowledge the plain facts that many men face. Painful stories of political, social, and legal disenfranchisement. A political ideology that mental health professionals openly embrace and endorse. It's dishonest shit like this. The willingness to blame men for a crisis in masculinity rather than clean their own damn house that convinces me that a modern medical health system is a bunch of con artists and abusers. Jane's organization will yell at men as oppressors up until they buy the bullet that kills them. Then suddenly they do an about-face and say, "What's wrong with you? Why aren't you coming to us for help?" How are you ever going to get men to use your service if you blame them for not using it, misrepresent them, and ignore why they're suicidal in the first place, Jane? The irony is that COM and other government-funded ideological services don't even listen to what men are actually saying. In one of their surveys, men said that they didn't talk about their problems because they felt ashamed, didn't want to discuss their feelings, and did not want to make a fuss. Did not want to make a fuss. Jehovah, too, writes, "You could see the unwillingness of men to receive one-sided help more like a blessing than a curse. Since you cannot use the women's shelters model, a more dynamic and altruistic approach can be taken. Instead of 'come here to get help,' more of a 'come here to heal yourself by being helpful.' In practice, you're already doing it, but don't seem to appreciate the beauty of this condition. This means that no outside help is needed, since the people that use the shelter are not there to use resources, but to add to them. This may mean a slow start, but it brings the promise of future exponential growth. The trick is not to make it look like a collection of helpless victims, but a group of helpful saviors of each other." Like Jehovah too says, men don't want to feel like a burden. They want to get help as they give it, and that's a good thing. Maybe the very idea of a helpline is opposed to the kind of help men need. Maybe we have to change the service to suit men, rather than demand men change to suit the service. When I started Honey Badger Radio, I always wanted to create a helpline. It's been a consistent theme throughout my advocacy, but now I realize that maybe Jehovah too is right. In practice, Honey Badger Radio is already helping. There is an underground reservoir of men who live lives of quiet desperation. They aren't so damaged that they're homeless or dealing with debilitating mental illness like schizophrenia or extreme drug abuse. They may struggle with anxiety issues, depression. They may be unemployed or marginally employed. They may be living on a couch with family or friends. They aren't on the streets. Maybe they've thought about killing themselves but haven't bought the bullet yet. And service agencies don't really care about them till they can append another adjective to man, define them in another category: homeless man, suicidal man, mentally ill man, drug addict. And even then, they often only care insofar as those marginal men impact others. These are the men I want to help. The men who need a place to tell their stories, the men who need a way to help as they are helped. As Jehovah too says, this means that no outside help is needed, since the people that use the shelter are not there to use resources, but to add to them. Exactly. To those men and all men, I say this: there is no crisis of masculinity. You're not doing anything wrong as men. Your identity has got you to this point. It has helped you cope with expectations and demands and outright persecution that should have, by all rights, broken you. You don't need to change your desire not to be a burden, because your stories aren't a burden. They're a gift, a heritage, a history, a way of telling other men they're not alone, and something more. Men's stories are a gift to women, even if most women don't realize it yet. We here at Honey Badger Radio are not mental health professionals, and most times I'm pretty damn sure that's a good thing. We're artists, and we're storytellers. We can't create a helpline for men, but we can create an archive, a place where men's stories matter, a place where you can walk through the door and see a library of the words society doesn't want to hear. PH7 Oslo writes, "Take calculated risks whenever possible, please. As I see it, you are the resource in shortest supply. Wouldn't want to lose you. Take care." You're not going to lose me, and I take everything you and other people have said about the risks to heart. However, if someone doesn't take that first step, it will never happen. A domestic violence shelter for men will happen. A true helpline for men will never happen. A true helpline staffed by people who would never say something like, "There's a crisis in masculinity," or "Men don't use our service, therefore there's something wrong with them." And you know what? The amount of difficulty it takes just to put in place one small way of helping men, a place where their stories can be heard, archived, and not ignored as illegitimate or marginalized as actively harmful for women. We have to do this without support from banks, financial institutions, corporate donors, grants. We have to do this ourselves, clawing out this space till our fingernails tear and bleed. That should say something about the bullshit narrative the ideologues have spun about men's power in society. Men's power is to serve, not be served. When men have the least need, everyone turns their back. Well, not me. That fundraiser will make $40K, even if I have to cover the shortfall myself. And again, I'm okay with this failing because someone else chose not to step up. I'm not okay with it failing because I didn't. If that means 6K or 14K, I will pay it, and I will pay it gladly, because this will be ours, our success. As much as I heal you, you heal me. Your stories heal me. Your stories of men are not a burden. They are a key to our freedom. I'm not useless, I'm not weak, and I'm not helpless. I am not a victim, and neither are you. And I'm not going to fail you.